The final lesson in topic 7 is the reasons for Saddam's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 and the subsequent Gulf War of 1991. So, I guess, why did Saddam decide to invade this small neighboring country so closely allied to other states in the Arab world, which he had, of course, offended through the Iran-Iraq War, and, most importantly, the Western powers? What we need to know about Kuwait is this. It's a small, oil-rich state that's on the southern border of Iraq, and it has wonderful connections to the Persian Gulf. Kuwait had actually been run by the British up until 1961. In fact, Britain had run at one point both Iraq and Kuwait simultaneously, but Britain doesn't leave Kuwait until 1961. In 1963, Iraq will reluctantly recognize Kuwait's independence. Iraq had always had this sort of idea that Kuwait was its sovereign territory. In 1990, much later than this, Iraq is again threatening Kuwait. Saddam had wanted to increase oil production in Iraq, but Kuwait and Saudi Arabia had refused. What effectively Saddam was saying is that I need to increase oil production because I'm broke from this war. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, refused to do this. They figured if Saddam had increased the price of oil, or rather increased the production of oil, the price of oil would drop, and the money that countries like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia would receive for their oil would be less. As such, they refused Saddam's request, and Saddam, being in this organization of petroleum exporting countries, was obliged to follow. This, of course, angered Saddam. Saddam also, I suppose, was angered at Kuwait because the Kuwaitis had started to ask for their money back. The Kuwaitis had lent Saddam a good bit of money in the Iran-Iraq War, and they started to demand the repayment of funds given to Iraq during this war. And Saddam claims this is an insult, okay, as Iraqi lives had apparently defended Kuwait. He also accused Kuwait of drilling under Iraq's borders and taking oil that belonged to Iraq. With discontented home building, he decides to invade Kuwait on the 2nd of August, 1990. He sends 300,000 troops across the border and overran the country in a matter of just 3 days. The world was entirely taken by surprise when he did this. Almost all of the Arab countries and all of the countries in the Middle East opposed Saddam's takeover. The United Nations Security Council agreed to impose complete trade sanctions against Iraq. What's, I guess, really important to note about this is this was the first time and the most effective time the UN has acted to impose sanctions on any one country. These are, I suppose, the most complete and effective sanctions ever imposed by the UN. Despite all of this, and despite this, Saddam's response to the UN sanctions was one of defiance. He declares Kuwait a province of Iraq. He tries to win Arab support, indeed, by saying that Iraqi forces would only draw from Kuwait when the Israelis have withdrawn their forces from the Palestinian lands that they had occupied since 1967. All of the Arab countries were leery of Saddam's claims. Of course, the Palestinians were thrilled, but most of the Arab states still condemned Iraq for its invasion of Kuwait. Not only that, news soon starts to emerge that atrocities are being committed by Iraqi troops against Kuwaiti citizens. Thousands of Kuwaiti protesters are arrested, hundreds are gunned down. Many of these people are gunned down deliberately in front of their families. Saddam had also ordered the detention of hundreds of foreign hostages, many of whom were Westerners caught in Iraq and Kuwait who were working for oil companies, and these included women and children. Not only that, Saddam started using the women and children as human shields. He was putting them near military targets, areas that were potentially threatened by the bombing raids of either other Arab states or Western powers in response to his invasion of Kuwait. This behavior was widely condemned, and international outrage spread. Famous interview of Saddam holding 5-year-old Stuart Lockwood, a British citizen whose family had lived and worked in Iraq. For Western powers, the hostage use, and particularly the human use of Western citizens as human shields, was something that was completely intolerable. The American reaction was was one of absolute and abject horror. Of course, the Americans are a little bit concerned, of course, not to get too involved into the Middle East. They know that anytime you can get involved in the Middle East, you can be accused of being a colonial power again. And the United States is keen to A, protect its oil, but B, also sort of avoid the natural backlash of becoming an occupying force in a Muslim country. However, when the King of Saudi Arabia invites the Americans, Americans were pretty quick to oblige. In fact, the Americans since 1957 have had a policy that if the oil is threatened and they were able to, they would ensure that that military force was used to protect the supply of oil. The multinational force that's assembled as a consequence of this invasion and the invitation of the United States to intervene is one of the largest ever assembled. 34 countries will join this coalition in total. And one of the things that gives this coalition legitimacy is the fact that many countries in the Gulf region join it, such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. All of these majority Muslim countries are now against Saddam. So the legitimacy of the American and British and French contingents, really the leading forces in this, is strengthened by the fact that they're supported by so many other Arab countries. So Saddam is basically not able to claim that this is some sort of Western crusades against against Arabs and Islam, which is something that other countries, or rather in the Second Gulf War of 2003, he was able to claim to rally support against the Americans. This leads to the Gulf War, which took place in January and March of 1991. I remember this vividly. It was one of the first wars almost entirely broadcast on TV. The war to liberate Kuwait became known as the Gulf War, and later the First Gulf War, because the second one ensues in 2003. It began, as the second one did, with a 5-week air assault on military targets, on airports, on bridges, factories, and roads. The coalition forces, predominantly the British and the Americans, were able to establish absolute air superiority over Iraq. And they were not only that, armed with the most up-to-date weapons in the world. Saddam hoped that world opinion would turn against the coalition and promised the mother of all battles, but all of this came to naught. He tried to involve Israel by firing Scud missiles at Israel with the hope that this would cause a split between the West and the Arab allies, i.e. try to provoke Israel into the war on the side of the United States. And he was thinking if Israel attacks Iraq, then the Arabs would no longer support the Americans. This was in fact not the case. The American government tried hard and leaned on the Israelis really hard not to intervene, even though their country was under nightly attack by Iraqi ballistic missiles known as Scuds. Some pretty big damage was caused to Tel Aviv, amongst other areas of Iraq, or rather Israel. In February, the ground attack begins. The Iraqi forces are no match for the coalition, and they're quickly defeated with incredibly heavy casualties. The United States and coalition troops were better armed, better motivated. The Iraqis, a lot of them had been conscripted into the army and forced to fight for Saddam, and they weren't necessarily that enthusiastic to protect this man. Not only that, the United States called on the Kurds in the north and the Shiites in the south to rise up and overthrow Saddam. They both actually do rise up. However, in the Shiite south, about 50,000 are killed by Saddam's forces. Other reprisals were expected against the Kurdish north. What ultimately ends this war is the fact that a humanitarian catastrophe basically looms. The United States and British realize that they're not really able to overthrow Saddam and at the same time establish a secure Iraq in the end of the war. So what happens is at the end of the war, the coalition forces stop short of Baghdad. There are a lot of people, especially within the U.S. government, who wanted to go further and get rid of Saddam altogether. However, the UN mission had been restricted to the liberation of Kuwait, and America's Arab allies probably wouldn't have supported a complete U.S. takeover of Iraq. Therefore, they stopped short. And to protect the coalition, to protect the victory, they allowed Saddam to effectively survive. The United States would use the war then to establish a military presence in the Gulf and to dominate the world's oil resources. And the war effectively ends on the 28th of February. The ceasefire is effectively signed. Now, the Operation Desert Storm, as it became to be known, which is the name of the U.S. assault, was one of the most effective military engagements in history, period. It was an entirely one-sided campaign. Saddam, the only real retribution he's able to hold out against them is the fact that he sets many of the oil wells in Kuwait on fire, and you see that in the picture in the bottom right. American absolute air superiority and the fact that they are able to establish a no-fly zone where no Iraqi planes can take off whatsoever, or they'll be utterly destroyed, meant that they can destroy most of the Iraqi equipment, tanks, artillery, missile sites, what have you, before they're even able to fire. There's one, the scene here in the sort of the top left-hand corner gives you an indication of the scale of what an American airstrike can do to a mobile Iraqi tank column. The sort of, I suppose this slide reiterates a lot of what I just said. The weapons inspections that followed. So after the war, a month after the ceasefire, the United Nations Special Committee started a search to destroy Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. UNSCOM, as it was called, really was looking for to limit, that is, Saddam's ability to wage mass war and to destroy his own people. They remember very well that Saddam had used weapons of mass destruction against the Kurds in the late 1980s, I believe it was 1988. They were very wary of this happening again, and as such, they went and searched out the majority of Saddam's warheads. The Iraqis had to cooperate at this particular time. They had to admit that it had stockpiled things like nerve gas and chemical weapons. And these weapons inspectors also uncovered the fact that Saddam had begun a nuclear program. It was not, however, able to eliminate all of Iraq's biological weapons. Nevertheless, really by 1995, the Iraqi government was confident that sanctions would soon be lifted and confessed to the production of some anthrax and nerve gas while claiming that stockpiles had been destroyed during the Gulf War. The Iraqis, I suppose, were asked for more information, but the UN special committee that was looking after weapons didn't receive this. From 1995 on, the United States begins to demand regime change. In 1995, Saddam's son-in-law, a man who had fallen out of favor with Saddam because of a family feud, defects to Jordan. He told those who questioned him in Jordan that after the Gulf War, Saddam's second son had been given the job of hiding Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. His second son was Uday Hussein. He was later promised a pardon, actually, this son-in-law, and returned to Baghdad, where Saddam had him shot 3 days later. The Americans started to become very increasingly worried about Saddam after 1995, that he would get revenge on them. And as such, they start to demand for regime change before they would agree to lift the sanctions. Within a short period of time, though, the living conditions of Iraq and the Iraqi people started to become hard. The blockade that prevented imports such as machinery, fertilizers, medicines, books even, started to really bite, and there was a sharp decrease in the standard of living. Iraq wasn't allowed to sell oil. After a little while, they were allowed to sell some, but very, very limited amounts, just enough to get a little bit of money. As Iraq imported much of its food, it had disastrous consequences. Thousands of people started to starve. Many children were dying each month. And this started to have an effect on whether or not they'd keep up with the sanctions. Additionally, Iraq was not allowed to import chlorine to purify water in case it was used for making chemical weapons. Contaminated water led to outbreaks of things like dysentery, and it reckoned that between 250,000 and 500,000 children died due to dysentery in this period. With the humanitarian crisis worsening, the UN came up with a plan by 1996 to allow Iraq to sell its oil in order to buy food, and this was known as the Oil for Food program. This program was run by the UN. It brought much-needed relief to the desperate people of Iraq. Yet, however, the end of sanctions, or the reduction in sanctions, didn't or I guess even sanctions in general, didn't increase opposition to Saddam's regime, let alone lead to rebellion. Saddam was pretty effective at using terror, just as he ever was, to purge his party, to purge people who were disloyal. A special army unit is created to protect the president, and nearly all the top jobs in government are taken away and ensured they're in the hands of Sunni Muslims, particularly those of Saddam's ultimate loyal family and tribe. Because Saddam had still so much control, Saddam had allowed the filming of the mass suffering. So, in other words, the fact that he was ultimately responsible starts to be, the further you get away from the war, the longer the sanctions continue, less of an important issue. And by filming suffering, especially for Arab television networks, throughout the Arab region, it started to show that Iraq was now, instead of being the aggressor, the victim of of a very uncaring West, particularly the Americans, and international opinion begins to change against the policy of sanctions with Iraq. What all of this leads to is Iraq, by the late 1990s, starting to emerge from isolation. Saddam, during this time, doesn't want to give up all his secret weapons, and had always tried to disrupt the UN's weapons inspectors. Besides, he started to know that inspection teams were working closely with the US CIA and other Western intelligence agencies, and he suspected that they were planning to overthrow them. Saddam, in 1997, takes a very unprecedented and aggressive step, and he kicks all of UN weapons inspectors out of Iraq. By 1998, American and British planes will start bombing Iraqi military sites because they can't be sure of what's going on there. Despite the commonly held view that Iraq had no more weapons of destruction, weapons of mass destruction. Most Arab states had relatively been happy up until the late 1990s to see Iraq taught a lesson in 1991, to see it punished in the subsequent years. However, when in 1998, U.S. Secretary of State under Bill Clinton, Madeleine Albright, was asked on television if the starvation of 500,000 people in Iraq was justified, she said it had been worth it. This started to cause a lot of widespread anger in the Arab world, and several states started to trade with Iraq again, and Iraq slowly emerges from international isolation. By 1999, the UN had approved unlimited oil exports from Iraq, and Saddam had restored diplomatic relations with all of its neighbors. At the end of the 1990s, Saddam actually emerges in a strong position. He had challenged the UN, he had challenged the USA, and he had survived. Now, really, effectively, especially because the US was the one and only world superpower, he starts to look very good. And by the late 1990s, George W. Bush, the son of the former president of the United States, who was president when Iraq was invaded in 1991, comes to the presidency of the United States. There begins renewed talk of Washington of the need to remove Saddam. The need to remove Saddam, of course, would be furthered by the September 11th, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center, and would lead to the Gulf War that basically the Americans have just mildly extricated themselves from. That would be known as the Second Gulf War, which took place between 2003 and give or take 2008. Saddam Hussein in that war would be overthrown, but for the purposes of your course, it ends with the fact that Saddam, by 1999, to challenge the United States, had undergone complete annihilation militarily, had in the intervening years defied the United States, maintained a degree of weapons production, but suffered under humongous sanctions. By the late 1990s, the opinion of the Arab world changes towards Saddam, and Saddam is able to, I suppose, use that to alleviate sanctions and to put Iraq back squarely on its own feet. Saddam, by 1999, again, was looking good in the eyes of the Arab world. So Saddam Hussein was sort of like a cat with 9 lives, a man who should have been extinguished many, many times in his career, but comes back, having not ever won a war, to be a man who is still able to claim at least victory because he had survived.